Welcome to room 9, the region's largest classroom. I am Mrs. Wright and I teach at Monroe Elementary in St. Charles. Today I will be teaching a reading lesson meant for second graders. But as always, everyone, adults, kids, no matter your grade, you are welcome to learn with us. So hey friends, I am super happy to be back. And I hope you are loving all these episodes. There are so many awesome teachers on Teaching in Room 9 who are working so hard to bring you lessons right to your living room, maybe to your classroom. So we really hope that you are enjoying these. And we are going to learn about poetry today. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you. But hold on. I'm getting ahead of myself as usual. Right now, we need to do a check of our brain and our body. So we have to get our brain and our body ready to learn. So hopefully you are in the green zone. If you are not in the green zone, you need to do something to get yourself from either blue, red, or yellow and into the green, okay? So if you're in the red zone, you probably need to get an adult to help you calm down. If you are in the yellow zone, maybe you're feeling excited, silly, nervous, some deep breaths always help me when I'm in the yellow zone. And just like taking a minute and being very still helps me when I'm in the yellow zone. When I am in the blue zone, I need to like get a drink of water. I need to stand up, maybe do some jumping jacks, maybe dance to some of my favorite music. So whatever you need to do to get yourself to the green zone, I want you to go ahead and do that. I am going to do some deep breathing, okay? So we breathe in through our nose for 3 seconds, we hold it for 3 seconds, and then we push out the breath for 3 seconds. Remember, when you breathe it in, you push it all the way down to your belly. Are you ready? Here we go. Great job. Do it again. And here we go. Awesome, friends. All right, so today we are going to be learning about poetry. You actually don't need anything to write on or with today, so that's first. We are going to learn about poetry, and we're going to try and hit all of these today if we have enough time, but we will for sure understand and identify the characteristics of poetry. We're going to work on that several times. Read and analyze poetry, and write a poem. We might not get to the writing a poem today. Fingers crossed. But I want to start by introducing you to a poet. A poet is someone who writes poetry. Poetry is a type of writing. And we're going to learn more about what poetry is by reading this book. So, I am a teacher. That's someone who teaches, right? You are a student, someone who learns. Anyone can be a learner, right? So poets are someone who writes poetry. Like an author is someone who writes books, okay? So this author, Don Tate, he wrote a book about a famous poet who writes poetry. And I thought this was just a really great book and a good way to introduce poetry. So we're going to jump right in. It is a longer book, so I might do a little talking throughout it, but probably not stopping as much as I normally do. What I want you to pay attention to while I read, I want you to pay attention to what does this book teach you about poetry. So it's going to kind of tell you some things as we're reading. It's a true story about George Moses Horton, and he's a poet. So pay attention to what this book teaches you about poetry. So that's what I want you to be looking for as I read, okay? Okay, let's do another deep breath. Great job. All right, here we go. We're gonna shift a little. The remarkable story of George Moses Horton, poet. Oh, I see. I'm supposed to read poet. The remarkable story of George Moses Horton. Okay. It says, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. George loved words. He wanted to learn to read, but George was enslaved. That means that he was a slave. He and his family lived on a farm in Chatham County, North Carolina, where they were forced to work long hours. There wasn't much time for much else. Besides, George knew his master would not approve of slaves reading. But that didn't stop George from admiring the language that was all around him. Inspirational words read from the Bible, hopeful words delivered in a sermon, lively words sung in songs. So he's saying the first words that he really heard were from like these people going to church. George was determined to learn to read. When white children studied their books, he lingered nearby. That means he kind of hung out around them. He listened as they repeated the letters of the alphabet. Soon, George could recite the alphabet himself. It says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. His mother would have liked to help him, but she couldn't. Instead, she gave George one of her most valuable possessions, a Wesley hymnal, a book of songs. It was George's very first book. He scanned the pages, trying to make out the letters. It was no use, though. He could not read the words. So I'm thinking his mom can't read either because it said she would have liked to help him, but she couldn't. Then George found an old spelling book. It was tattered and some pages were missing, but it was enough to get him started. Tattered means like it was kind of like ripped up. George thumbed through its pages. He recognized some of the letters. At night, when he should have been resting after a long day of work, George studied by firelight. His eyes burned from the smoke. Soon he could make out a few words. Before long, he could understand entire sentences. Over time, George taught himself to read. That's pretty cool. From that point forward, George not only loved words, he could read and understand them too. George read verses from the New Testament. He read books, newspaper articles, advertisements, whatever he could find. Most of all, George read poems. He loved beautiful poetry. It says, "Rise up, my soul, and let us go up the gospel feast." From early morning until late at night, George tended cattle on his master's farm. That means he took care of the cattle. Cattle is like cows. While he worked, George composed his own poetry, mingling his words with the tunes of familiar songs. He hadn't learned how to write his poems down yet, so he committed them to memory. Words and rhythms were stored up inside his head. His verses swayed with emotion, like the music of Sunday services. They kept him strong as he grew to be a young man. So what this is saying is he always had all these words and these poems floating around in his head. So he was always thinking about them. And it says his verses swayed with emotion. So he had a lot of emotion in his verses. When George was 17, his master decided to split up his estate. That means to sell everything he owned. He divided his possessions, land, cattle, wagons, tools, among his family. Slaves were considered to be property too. So George's family was separated. George was given to his master's son. He feared he would never see his mother, brothers, and sisters again. Sad. George toiled in the fields on his new master's property. It was disagreeable work, but he found a little relief on Sundays. On that day, George walked 8 miles to the village of Chapel Hill, to the campus of University of North Carolina. There, he sold fruit and vegetables grown on his master's farm. He didn't mind the long walk, though. George welcomed the opportunity to get away. At first, the college students teased George. To distract himself from their insults, George recited his poetry. That means he said his poetry out loud. Words sweet as the fruit piled high in his cart sprung from his lips. Every eye grew wide and every mouth fell open at the sound of George's voice, uttering beautiful verses. The students were awestruck when they found out that he had composed them himself. So compose means to write. He wrote all these poems himself and people were amazed by his poetry. News of the slave poet raced through campus like a brisk flowing river. Students swarmed in close to hear George perform his verses. Some of them decided to help George. They gave him their books, English, grammar, and dictionaries, history and oratory, classic literature and poetry. George soaked up these new subjects like a sponge. One day, a student requested a poem for his sweetheart, that's like his girlfriend. George created a verse for the woman. He dictated the poem to the student, who wrote it out neatly. So he said the words and the student wrote it down. The young lady swooned when she read it. That means she was like, ah. After that, other students wanted George's poems, and they were willing to pay for them too. Okay, so he is becoming this really popular and heard of poet at his university or the university nearby. Remember, compose means to write. So George composed more than 12 love poems a week, selling them for 25 cents each. Some paid him with fine suits and shoes instead of money. In time, George dressed as sharply as the students themselves. With money, nice clothes, and newfound status, George felt freer than he had in all of his life. But he was not free. He remained the property of his master. George continued to work on the farm during the week and visit Chapel Hill on the weekends. The story of the slave poet reached the wife of a professor. Caroline Lee Hintz was a professor or a professional writer and published poet. So that means she was a writer who was very well known, and she had written poetry and it was published into books, out in the world for people to read. George's poems affected her deeply. Some made her smile, while others made her cry. She sought out George and taught him how to write poems on paper with a pen. After so many years of memorizing verses, George could now write them down. So she taught him how to write. That has to be an amazing feeling. Learning how to write for the first time and being able to finally write down all these wonderful things you're saying. Caroline arranged for George's poems to be printed in the Gazette, the newspaper of her hometown, Lancaster, Massachusetts. Now, George was a published poet. So it's somewhat published, means it's something that is out in the media. His poems protested his enslavement. No other American slave had done that before. Soon, George's work appeared in other newspapers, including Freedom's Journal, the first African-American-owned newspaper in the country. George's heart could barely contain his growing pride. So he's so proud of himself. He should be. With money from his writing and odd jobs, George was able to pay his master for his time so that he could live in Chapel Hill and work as a poet. It was an illegal arrangement, so it was not allowed what was happening. But his master didn't care. George was now a full-time writer, but he was still not a free man. So he was living like he was free. He lived in Chapel Hill. He was writing poems. People were paying him to write poems. But because he was owned by a master, he was paying his master to be able to live at Chapel Hill and write poetry for people. And this wasn't allowed. In time, George published The Hope of Liberty, his first book. He wanted to use his earnings to purchase his freedom. When editors at Freedom's Journal learned of his plan, they tried to raise money to help him. Influential people joined the cause, means important people who people listen to. Newspapermen, a college president, a governor, they offered a great deal of money, but George's master refused to sell his valuable slave. George was devastated. So he was so upset. He felt so down about it. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North worked to end slavery. They published books. They printed posters and pamphlets. They blanketed the South with their calls for enslaved people to rise up against their masters. Slaves who could read told their message. So these abolitionists, they're people who are helping to end slavery in the North. And they wanted the slaves to basically tell their owners that they didn't want to be slaves anymore and stop being their slaves. Kind of risky. As a result, more slaves did fight back, and some even killed their masters. Fear ruled the South. New laws were passed in North Carolina. People who printed and distributed anti-slavery materials were penalized. Worse yet, it became illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. It was illegal. Think about that. So basically, these new laws in North Carolina were trying to stop people from helping the slaves to become free. Now it was too dangerous for George to write poems that protested slavery. But he didn't stop writing altogether. He published his second book, the Poetical, I hope I said that right, Poetical Works of George M. Horton, which contained poems about life, love, death, and friendship. In 1861, war broke out between the North and the South, mainly over the issue of slavery. Most of the students went off to fight to defend the South. With few people left on campus to purchase his poems, George had no way to earn to pay for his time away from his master. He had to return to the farm. So this is one of his poems right here. Am I sadly cast aside on misfortune's rugged tide? Will the world my pains deride forever? The Civil War raged on for 4 long years. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln set the nation on a new course by signing the Emancipation Proclamation. That soon led to the end of slavery. At the age of 66, George was finally free. Now that he was a free man, George no longer had to remain on the farm. Later that spring, he packed his pens and paper and left. George went west with the Union Army, camping along the way. He wrote poems about his travels, about his family and friends back home, and about all the things he experienced in his long life. Here's one of his poems right here. I'll read it. I'll love thee as long as I live, all else but my life would I give, whatever thy condition may be, that thou waste as partial to me. George's love of words had taken him on a great journey. Words made him strong. Words allowed him to dream. Words loosened the chain of bondage long before his last day as a slave. So what this last part of the book is saying is being a poet helped him along his journey. So he fell in love with words and letters and putting words into sentences, and eventually he learned to read, and the lady taught him to write down his poems. And so he's saying that the words made him strong, and they let him dream, and they let him experience life that he couldn't have, and to write about the life that he did have. So I really liked this book. And this book was read, The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton. It was read with the permission of Peachtree Publishers. And so we are going to talk a little bit about, we don't have a ton of time, but we are going to talk a little bit about what poetry is. Okay, Molly's here. Come here. Do you want to say hi? She wants me to play with her. She brought me a toy. Nope, I'm recording. Okay, so we're going to write down what, oh my gosh, is poetry. What in the world is poetry? So think about what were some of the words or some of the ideas that you heard in this book that told you a little bit about what poetry is. In some of the poems I heard, and some of the things that they just told us. Think about, what is poetry? Yeah, poetry can rhyme. Oops, let me make sure. Yep, it can rhyme. This is not my best handwriting, but that's okay. But also, sometimes it doesn't. So there's a rhyme to it, like tide, hide, he said that. So sometimes there's a rhyme. It might be written in, yes, in lines, right? There's stanzas that are called lines. So it's not always complete sentences. What else do you think poetry is? What is poetry? What else? Yeah, there's not always a main character. Like, books always have a main character, right? So there's not always a main character. Yeah, there's not a lot of rules, so no rules. The only rule is that there's no rules. Okay? What else? What else is poetry like? Yeah, it's kind of like song. It uses figurative language. We're going to talk more about that. Nice. What else does it do? Yeah, it describes, like songs, right? So that describes. Details. They can be long or short. Oftentimes they share about feelings or emotions. Guys. Yeah, so poetry is a lot of different things. And it doesn't follow the same kind of rules as a book because there aren't that many rules for poetry. So that's where we're gonna kind of end today. And a little more this week. We are going to write some poetry. We're gonna study some poems, but today we've learned just what poetry is. So be on the lookout for poetry as you're reading, and I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Teaching in Room 9 is made possible with support of Bank of America, Dana Brown Charitable Trust, Emerson, and viewers like you.